asks why. I'm Hannah Abrams, and I'm joined, as always, by Avi Cooper. And unfortunately, tonight we are down one of our trio because Tony is unfortunately feeling under the weather. So feel better, Tony. But while Tony isn't here, on this episode we are joined by a special guest, Dr. Mike Todorovic. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. I love this podcast. So thank you for having me on.
We are absolutely honored. Usually we have approximately 30 seconds of breezy chit chat about the weather. How's the weather there?
To be honest, the weather is very dodgy, is the term that we would use over here in Australia. It's been raining for a couple of days. It's the middle of winter, but it's still about, what is it? I think right now it's about 20 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that would be in Fahrenheit. It's probably, the weather here is like Florida, where I live in Queensland. So it's,
So a Floridian winter?
yeah, I would say that. Very humid, very sticky, but it's great. I live right near the beach, and the university that I'm at is right next to the beach. So generally it's stunning, but right now, not so much.
See, we're also dealing with some major time zone differences.
That's true.
Mike is
Yeah,
already into tomorrow for us.
I'm in the future,
Yeah,
guys.
yeah, he's in the future. Yeah, Hannah.
And
So
it's
we're
not that
doing that.
great.
Yeah, let's say he's was 17 hours ahead, I think, in time zone for you, Hannah. I think so.
Wow. All right.
It's,
Well,
yeah, it's 11:15 on Monday for me. So,
my mind is blown. This episode is
Yeah,
now going to be about time zones.
yeah.
Here from
Well,
relatively sunny Seattle.
Well, Mike, we're so thrilled to have you on the show, and we've all learned a lot from you over the years, and it's really great to just sort of like just finally have you on as a guest and to be able to learn from you and to chat. So can you introduce yourself a little bit to our audience?
yeah, no problem. I'm Mike Todorovic. I'm an associate professor of physiology at the Bond University Medical School. And I'm also the co-host of Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike's medical podcast, and also Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike's YouTube channel, where we talk all things anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology, and pharmacology. And when you say you've learnt from me, I think I've learnt far more from you and the team than you've learnt from me, from your tutorials, from the podcast. I love the Curious Clinicians podcast. So again, like I said, it's an honor to be able to sit down and have a chat with you about the human body.
Well, the feeling is very much mutual. Well, so this episode, it's going to break a little bit from our typical format because we're going to be talking about a physiologic topic to start, and then we're going to pivot to learning from Mike, who's a master medical educator. And anyone who's seen his videos on YouTube, listened to his podcast, the Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike's medical podcast, along with his co-host, as you mentioned, Dr. Matt Barton. You're really an incredible you're just incredibly talented at breaking down complex concepts and explaining them, not just in a digestible way, but in an interesting, engaging way that really just, it's really remarkable. And one of the videos that we really loved is one that you did explaining the sodium potassium ATPase pump, which you posted way back in February 2022. And it's like a very specific topic, right? Like just zooming right in on this pump. So why did you devote a whole video to this one pump?
It's a good question. When I did the video, I put in the title and also made the statement in the video, the sodium potassium ATPase pump is the most important enzyme in the body. And because I said that, I got many comments of people going, oh, it's not an enzyme, which it is. So they're wrong, first of all. The second part being the most important in the body, that's obviously a bit of hyperbole. There's many important enzymes in the body, but it's super important. It's so important that virtually every cell in our body has sodium potassium ATPase pumps embedded in their membranes. Some, like the distal convoluted tubule of our nephrons, have 50 million of these pumps per cell. So it's super important. It maintains ion balance, water balance. For the excitable cells in our body, like our muscles and our nervous tissue, it allows for them to do the things that they do best, which is contract and send signals. So without this pump, so many cells and tissues within our body wouldn't be able to do the things that they do. So it is important, and my argument stands that it is the most important enzyme in the body.
After watching the YouTube video, I feel like I buy the statement.
Thank you.
It's a very important enzyme. I think, and that's really what our hope was to talk through a little bit the importance of this pump and how it works in the body with you today. I would love, in terms of where we should start with this very fundamental pump, could we start maybe by explaining the resting membrane potential and maybe start with defining that?
Yeah, no problem. So I think colloquially people know that the body has electricity in it. People always refer to the electricity in our body, and our nerves are sending electrical impulses. But I think a lot of people don't realize that the electricity or the electrical currents we have in our body are very different to those that we have in the wires of our electronics at home, where the electrical current is sent down the wire through electrons that are getting excited and playing hot potato with energy with each other all the way down that wire. But that's not what happens in the body. The electrical currents don't go down the cells, they go across the membranes of our cells. And what that requires is a charge difference from one side of a membrane to another. So it's either got to be positive or negative on one side compared to the other. And this is where the sodium potassium pump comes into play, because what its job is, it takes 3 sodium ions. So the great thing is we don't use the electrons here, we're using the ions, which are charged atoms or elements, right? So, you ingest minerals and salts, and once they're in the fluids of our body, they obtain a charge, either positive or negative. And so the sodium potassium pump will take 3 positive sodium ions and throw it out of the cell, and take 2 positive potassium ions and throw it into the cell. And what it's just generated is a difference, a gradient, a gradient of concentration, chemical gradient, where 3 sodium have gone outside, so most sodium is outside of the cell now, and 2 potassium inside, so most potassium is inside the cell. But it's also created an electrical gradient, because it's thrown 3 positive sodium out and 2 positive potassium in. So if you were to take a voltmeter, which can measure the charge difference from outside to inside, you'll see that the outside is now slightly positive compared to the inside of the cell. And that difference is around about 4 millivolts. The inside's about negative 4 millivolts charge compared to outside. Now, the other thing that's happening here is that our membranes of our cells are generally impermeable to anything that has a charge to it, sodium and potassium, unless we have some channels specifically for them. And we have a channel for potassium in our membranes, and the door's creaked open a little bit, and the potassium can slide out. And because of diffusion and things go down their concentration gradient, because most of the potassium's inside, it sneaks outside down its concentration gradient, again, carrying that positive charge with it. So now the outside's becoming even more positive compared to the inside, and now you have a significant charge difference from outside to inside. Now, the thing is, you've got 2 things happening. You've got a concentration gradient and an electrical gradient. The potassium is moving down its chemical gradient from inside out, but because it's positive outside and the potassium's positive, it's repelling each other. So not all of the potassium is leaking out. It's going to get repelled at some point. And the point in which it hits this equilibrium, in which it's gone down its concentration gradient enough and being repelled enough by the positive charge, that's what we call the resting membrane potential. And that charge difference is different from one cell to another. But it's amazing, because if you take a typical, let's say, neuron, for example, where the charge difference is about 70 millivolts from one side of the membrane to the other, that membrane's only 10 nanometers thick. So if you were to have a look at that per meter, that's about 7 million volts per meter, which is a lightning bolt worth of electrical charge that we are generating. So it's spectacular.
Wow, we all have lightning bolts within us.
Yeah,
we do.
So, summarizing a little bit, it's so amazing. So I think we don't think a lot about these ionic channels in our clinical lives, but we are bringing in potassium, we are exchanging that for sodium. Then the potassium, that itself generates an electrical gradient. And then the potassium flows down its chemical, so its concentration gradient, back out of the cell in some equilibrium which is established with the electrical gradient. And that's what establishes our resting membrane potential.
Beautiful. Perfect. Absolutely.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about how the sodium potassium ATPase pump specifically works? How does the ATP come in?
Yes. So because there's this gradient established, when the pump throws sodium outside, it's doing it against its concentration gradient. So it's sort of throwing things uphill. And the potassium it's throwing inside, again, throwing that uphill. So we need energy to do this. So the pump requires ATP, which is our primary energy currency, in order to be able to throw both of these ions against their concentration gradient. And anytime something in the body utilizes ATP, it's telling us it's important. And the fact that we're doing this for these particular pumps shows us how important these pumps are, especially when you have a look at the gray matter of our brain, for example. There's estimates that more than 50% of our ATP in our gray matter is dedicated just to these pumps alone. So it's so important.
Amazing. And I guess, like you said, something that's this core to our existence. I guess I'm wondering, like, how did it come to be this way? On the show, we talk a lot about origins and how we got here. So I guess it's so elegant. Like, where did this pump come from? Like, can you give us a sense of the evolutionary history of how life came to have this?
So, okay, Avi, I want you to pretend you're going back. I want you to go back a couple of generations. So you're thinking about your parents and you think about their parents, and now go back maybe 5 million more generations back. Now you're a prokaryotic, you're a single-celled bacteria, maybe archaea, and you are floating in this very salty marine aquatic environment. You are in the primordial soup. Now, you've got a couple of options here. You know that the outside's very salty compared to the inside. You can either evolve a very rigid cell wall and become a plant, or maybe you can just give up and go, oh, whatever the external environment or osmotic gradient is, that'll just be mine. I'll be happy with that. And that you'll become a jellyfish, maybe, if that's the case. Or you could go, well, you know what? I'm inevitably going to take in some of that salt, but I need to figure out a way to pump that salt back out to maintain fluid balance. And so this is where the evolution of the sodium potassium pump came about, was to originally pump out this salt that these single-celled organisms have taken on board so that they don't obtain too much fluid. Because as we know, wherever salt goes, water follows, right? Yes, we don't want it to burst. So this is the original evolution of those pumps. And it just happened to be that over time, with evolution, as we know, we have various functions can evolve off the back end of its original or primary function, which we call exaptations. So its ability to maintain this ionic gradient, which is a charge gradient that we now use for our excitable tissues, that's an exaptation from its original purpose, which was to help pump out the salt to maintain fluid balance, which we still utilize it for.
Interesting. So it's sort of like we have adapted it to suit our purposes, which is not its original intent.
No, exactly. And there's a term which I love called a spandrel from Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary biologist, great author, unfortunately passed away now, but he coined the term spandrel, which is a phenotype that has come about off the back end of some evolutionarily developed function, like the chin, for example. We've got a chin, it doesn't really have a function, but it's a phenotype that's evolved just from the shape of the skull, right? That's a spandrel. But if you've got a spandrel that has a function, like in this case, that's an exaptation. So now we've got its function as an exaptation.
Amazing. Okay, so we really, really do need sodium potassium pumps to exist.
Most important enzyme in the body, remember?
Exactly. To have homeostasis.
Or we could be jellyfish.
Exactly.
Just saying.
I think I like my life. Although traveling is fun. So are there parts of the body that are more reliant on this essential enzyme than others? Is there some sort of differential within the body about, how much, how reliant, certain parts of the body are versus others on this pump?
Yeah, I mean, virtually every single cell in the body will have this pump for multiple reasons. Like I said, maintaining ion balance, fluid balance, but also creating a resting membrane potential. There's a lot of evidence now. Originally, when we spoke about this pump, we spoke about its importance for excitable tissues. Like I mentioned earlier, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. The resting membrane potential says, at rest, it's got the potential to change, which it does, for contraction to occur for muscle tissues or for neurons to send a signal. But we now know that the sodium potassium pump, because it's in all cell membranes of the body, we know that it has functions outside of this. So, for example, the beta cells of our pancreas, without the sodium potassium pump, we wouldn't be able to secrete insulin. That's an example. And you wouldn't call that tissue an excitable tissue per se, but because its ability to develop a resting membrane potential, very important. We know in the kidneys, like I said earlier, 50 million sodium potassium pumps per cell of the distal convoluted tubule. And that's telling you how important it is. It helps us throw that sodium back out of the tubular cell, creating a deficiency in that tubular cell, which then creates a gradient so that any sodium that was going to be peed out essentially gets reabsorbed back into these tubular cells. And piggybacking on that movement, you have amino acids, you've got glucose, you've got other ions, for example. And so without this, we wouldn't be able to reabsorb so many of the various things that we absorb. That includes the brain as well. Like I said, more than 50% of the energy of the grey matter is dedicated to the sodium potassium pump. So, yes, some tissues are probably more reliant on the pump as opposed to others, but even immune cells, for example, use the pump to establish a membrane potential so that they can perform their function as well.
Bringing it back to the blood.
It's everywhere, including the blood.
What do you think is the coolest part of this pump, its use in physiology?
I think, from what Avi said earlier, that the elegance of it. I love it when in biology something is simple, because as we know, very rarely is it simple. The fact it just throws 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in, and the repercussions of this are enormous. I just love that something so simple, all of our existence can hinge on this very simple action. I think that is the most beautiful thing.
It's like E equals MC squared, right? I mean, it's like,
Yes,
the elegance of nature.
Yeah.
exactly.
So coming back to it, so you mentioned the kidneys. We do have many nephrologists who listen to our show, and you've mentioned the brain. Are there clinical relevance, especially in thinking about clinical medicine, relevance to this pump?
Oh, absolutely. I think either directly or indirectly, the sodium potassium pump is going to be associated with so many things clinically. So, for example, you could take any tissue of the body and you could look at something clinically relevant with this pump. You could take cardiac tissue, have a look at the heart, and look at the drug digoxin, which has been used for hundreds of years, and it inhibits the sodium potassium pump. Now, normally, the pump is going to, as we said, throw sodium out and potassium in. And then sodium, because of the pump, it's at a high gradient outside of the cardiac cell, it wants to diffuse in. And when it does diffuse in, calcium piggybacks and goes inside as well. And if calcium jumps into a muscle, the muscle contracts. And this is just part of that normal contraction relaxation process for the heart. But if you take digoxin and it inhibits this pump, the sodium doesn't get thrown outside and stays inside, which means there's no gradient and sodium doesn't want to leak inside, which means calcium can't either. And so now the thing here is that when we go back and have a look at the exchange that happens, I'm trying to think, did I say that calcium jumped in with it? Because what happens is calcium jumps out as it goes in. My apologies. When you've got the pump, let me start again with that. When you've got the pump throwing sodium out and potassium in, you've got the sodium gradient outside and sodium wants to diffuse inside. As it does that, calcium piggybacks and goes in the opposite direction and goes outside to reset that cardiac tissue so that it can relax due to part of its normal contraction relaxation. But if you take digoxin and block the sodium potassium pump, it can't throw sodium outside, so sodium stays inside, which means sodium isn't going to diffuse inside and calcium can't be thrown outside in exchange for it. So the calcium accumulates inside the cardiac tissue and you get a very strong contraction. And that very strong cardiac contraction gets fed through the vagus nerve and says, whoa, slow down, slows the heart down in response. So you have strong contraction, but a slower heart rate, which is the purpose of taking that digoxin. And that's all because of its blocking effect on the sodium potassium pump. But then you can have a look at neurons. So in neurons, without the sodium potassium pump, it doesn't reset. So we have an action potential that's sent because sodium's diffused in, potassium's diffused out. It's sent a signal down in a domino-like fashion, and we need the sodium potassium pump to reset the neuron. Without resetting the neuron, it can't send the next action potential, the next signal. It's been associated with epilepsy. So there's been some mutations in the sodium potassium pumps, which have led to accumulations of sodium inside the cell, which again leads to accumulations of calcium inside the cell, which leads to hyperexcitability and seizures. There's been links previously with the sodium potassium pump in the cerebellum. And so cerebellar dysfunction from alcohol intoxication, there's been some evidence that alcohol inhibits the sodium potassium pump. And this inhibition in part is one of the reasons why we have the motor dysfunction due to intoxication. So, I mean, you could pick any tissue and there's going to be an association with the sodium potassium pump.
Well, one of my favorite parts of the video where you broke this pump down and just beautifully explained the energetics of sort of going against or with electrochemical gradients. You compared it to climbing and then sliding down like a slide on a playground. And honestly, I wish I had learned it that way back in like undergrad and medical school, because it was such an intuitive way to teach it. Can you just review that for us again here?
Yeah, no problem. I think it's important when you go back to basics, in order to understand things like Brownian motion, the random movement of particles within a solution, it's not necessarily that intuitive. And so you've got to figure out ways to teach students as to how diffusion occurs, for example. For me, it's the simplest thing on the planet, but I shouldn't assume that for my students. So I always say to my students, if you've got any sort of solute, and it could be sodium, for example, in a high concentration gradient, it's like being at the top of a slide, right? You're up the top, you're high, you're at the high concentration gradient. If you want to go to an area where it's a low concentration gradient or a low concentration of sodium, so down the gradient, it's just like letting go of the bars on the side of the slide. You just go down the slide. It's all fun and games. It doesn't cost you any energy whatsoever to go from your high concentration gradient to your low. But if you want to go from a low concentration gradient to a high, you've got to climb the ladder to the slide. And that costs energy. And so that's the way that I try and explain the concentration gradients. Another thing I do, one of the things I like to do at the very beginning of, because this is one of my first lectures I tend to deliver, is I get all the students to the front of the classroom, and I tell them to close their eyes, and I bunch them up. This is pre-COVID when I was doing this. I bunch them up. So I've got, 40 students, all in-person students. I know, they turned up. And they're bunched up in a group at the front, and I tell them to close their eyes, and then I tell them to spin around for a minute, and I time that minute. And I say, when I say go, you are just going to walk straight ahead with your eyes closed, and when you hit something, just walk in the opposite direction. And so I say, go. And then we do that for 60 seconds, and then I say, stop, open your eyes. And this high concentration of students have now diffused themselves evenly across the classroom without any conscious volition whatsoever. They didn't know they were doing it. It just happened. And so that's another way I try and explain going from a high concentration gradient to a low.
What an incredible way to like experientially explain Brownian motion, right? Like, oh my goodness, that's so cool.
They do appreciate it. And also, no one likes sitting down for that amount of time either. Yeah. So gets them moving around a bit.
The definition of active learning.
That's right.
Well, I think that's maybe a good pivot point to talk a little bit about your journey in science, in medical education, how you approach teaching. Can you tell us a little bit, like, how did you get to where you are in your career?
Look, that's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. When you find out, let me know. So I started off. I was a researcher. I did my undergraduate as a science degree. I did my honors, and then I did my PhD. And I was doing my PhD in clinical neuroscience. I was actually looking at the genetics of Parkinson's disease. That was my PhD. And as I was doing that, I got asked by one of the academics, "Hey, I need somebody to fill in and just run a workshop on the gastrointestinal system for me." And I go, no problem, I can do it, easy. And I hadn't done the anatomy and physiology since undergraduate. So that weekend, I got the textbook and I just jumped into it and I started reading and drawing and all these types of things. And I probably spent 15 hours just going through all these things associated with the gastrointestinal tract for a 1 hour tutorial. And I got in as my very first time teaching, and I loved it. I had a blast. It was just working with the students, figuring out solutions, seeing them hit that aha moment, I finally get it, and then them thanking you as they leave. Like it was the compared to a PhD, which is thankless every step of the way, it was beautiful. And so I then put my hand up and said, I just want to do more teaching. And that was 15 years ago. And so ever since then, I've just been able to get more and more teaching. And then I was part of faculty. And then part of me getting my job at the university, they said, you need to finish your PhD in the next 6 months. And I went, no problem. Because I sort of left it in the background a little bit because I started to get obsessed with the teaching. I said, no problem. So then I smashed out my PhD, got it all sorted, and then I was on faculty and started to teach. And then that would have been, 10 years ago, that point would have been. It's been nearly 10 years, I think 10 years this year that I finished my PhD. So yeah, and then it's just gone from there, and I love it.
Incredible. And also just so realistic that it takes 15 hours to make 1 hour of
Yeah,
really
see
good
that math
content
that
when
math
you're,
checks out.
yeah, that checks out
Yeah,
for this
yeah.
podcast at least. Though we make half-hour shows. That's nice. But I think most people, unless there are a lot of Aussies listening to this episode, have probably heard of you from your content on Twitter and on YouTube. So I'm curious a little bit, how did you then get into digital education?
Yeah. For me, I think a big thing, so I think historically when we look at education in the university system within academia, a lot of it's been behind paywalls, right? You pay us, you come to this institution and we give you secret knowledge. And uh, through principle, I don't like that idea. I think that when it comes to knowledge, I get for degrees and things like that, yes, there needs to be an avenue for that. But when it comes to knowledge itself, I think that should be free and that should be available to all. And it's simply just a product of where we are within society at the moment. Everyone's online. Um, most of my university students, so more than 60% of Australian university students are Gen Z, and the vast majority in the future are going to be Gen Z. And so if you have a look, Gen Z use social media for 4 or more hours every single day. And now I don't know about either of you two, but I don't have 4 or more hours spare every day, let alone to spend it on social media. But they do. So they think it's important enough to dedicate that much time. And so for me, it's meeting the learner where they are, and where they are is on social media. And so that's why I jumped on there. I thought it was an easy way. And at first, it was just for my immediate students because I knew they were all on Instagram and on social media. And they even said that, thank you. We go to your Instagram page before we go to the course site. And that's just an
Wow.
indication as to, because again, it's a paywall thing. The university purchases learning management systems that take, 10-factor authentication to get into it. And you can't just open your phone and press a button, but you can with Instagram. So why not put the content there? So that's sort of the evolution of me going into the online space.
Can I ask you, do you find that we try to target our content to people who are somehow in the medical field, but we find that oftentimes the things that we're drawn to are not necessarily strictly physician topics or strictly super medical topics. Do you end up do you think about what audience is listening to you and whether lay people are listening, and does it change what you say and do at all?
in a way, I know that my primary target audience is aspiring health professionals and sometimes established health professionals. But I think one of the ways that I approach it is regardless of who you are, I try and start every video or podcast at as low as I possibly can, knowledge-wise, and try and build over that time so that everyone starts at the same point. I don't care where you're beginning your knowledge. I'm starting at the video at the same point, very basic stuff, very quickly build to a higher level, and then more slowly build to a higher level over that, so that I feel like I can discuss quite complex topics to anybody as long as I begin at that low level. I don't ever assume that anybody knows anything, because at the end of the day, even very, very smart people forget things and don't necessarily realize that something is the way that it is. Because I know that I forget stuff all the time. Another reason why I made the YouTube videos was so that next year when I present the same topic to my students, I don't have to go back into the textbook, because I forget stuff all the time. I just watch myself on YouTube and go, that's right, that's what I said, and I just deliver it again. So we all need to get back into it. So I think it's trying to get everybody at the same level and build from there.
And I think one of the things that it's really been just so impressive about the way that you teach online is the multimedia approach, the way you've succeeded in communicating knowledge so effectively in written form, in visual form with videos, and then in audio as well with podcasting, and they really all sort of stand alone. And it's like you would consider. I think someone could say, "Hey, like Dr. Mike has been really successful just with one of those avenues, and you've done all of them really well." So I guess I'm interested in, especially with your producing educational videos. I feel like that can be intimidating for people who maybe want to venture into digital medical education by making videos, but they're not sure how to get off the ground and they want to put out something that's high quality right away. So how did you get started with that?
Oh, that's a great question. And I was presenting at a conference recently on exactly this topic, utilizing things like YouTube to teach medical education. And after I presented, I had so many colleagues come up to me and say things like, I've wanted to do this for ages, but I'm too scared to just take that step and put myself online and so forth. And for me, I think a big part of it is, yeah, it can be frightening because there are very annoying people online. And that's to put it very lightly. Um, you open yourself up for criticism. And the one thing I love about it, I mean, I get things wrong all the time, all the time. And people say, oh, look, we've got a peer review process when we publish, journal articles and so forth to pick up errors like that. I truly think that if you post something online, if it's wrong, you're going to find out super quick, and you're going to find out in a very blunt, straightforward way. And that doesn't bother me in the slightest, because I have no problems thinking that I'm above criticism whatsoever. If somebody says, hey, you got this wrong, I'll be like, shit, thank you. I'm going to redo it. That's brilliant. I know that for future iterations. And so I think people need to come to terms with the fact that it is scary and just got to put yourself out there. I think importantly, one of the things that hold a lot of people back is they want to start with a polished product. It's not going to happen. If you watch our first set of YouTube videos, they are horrendous. I am boring. I'm slow. The quality's crap. I'm going, hi, yeah, so anyway, yeah, oh my God, horrendous. And I thought I was a good educator then. So it's just one of those things, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So don't be afraid to just put stuff out, because it will evolve and get better over time.
Yeah, we think of it like turbo peer review, is putting something online. And we, oftentimes for particularly specialized episodes, we'll ask for informal peer review from folks who are in that specialty, but there is no better peer reviewer than the internet.
Agreed.
Just they're going to catch everything.
Yeah, totally. And that's one of the reasons why I love it. I don't like the way they necessarily review it, but you figure it out. I know. You at least say, hey, just so you know, you got this part wrong. Not, hey, idiot, look what you did, you moron. So yeah, it can be a bit rough.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine, especially with a big platform. You know, this actually
Yeah.
really reminds me of our episode number 4 that Avi did on digitalis, why
Oh yeah.
digitalis turned Van Gogh's eyes, or vision yellow, or whether it did. We
or
sort of got
Mm.
didn't.
into it on the episode. But a big part of that was the sodium potassium ATPase pump. And I just think back to that time and I think, oh my gosh, we have come so far since then. We're getting close to 100 episodes, so we're
It's
particularly feeling
awesome.
nostalgic.
I love this podcast so much. It's in all honesty, I get so much. I wish I was succinct enough to be able to put across as much information. I think people could probably tell I'm very verbose, but I wish I was succinct enough to be able to get across the amount of information you do in 30 odd minutes. It takes me 30 minutes just to say my surname. So it's amazing. I love the podcast. Keep doing it. Do 1,000 episodes.
Very slowly. But you really read my mind, because one of the things we wanted to ask you about this idea of how do you get good at explaining complex topics is something that you do is break things down really digestibly. And you talked about it a little bit, starting from a basic level, working your way up in complexity. But when you first encounter a topic, I mean, how do you first approach breaking down something complex into these digestible chunks? How do you get even start to that process?
Matt and I, and so Matt's who I do my YouTube and podcast stuff with, we've spoken about this a couple of times, and we truly think the reason why we can do this relatively well is because neither of us were good students at school, neither of us were good students at university. We both of us found learning difficult. I found being able to put my attention into things that I've got ADHD. It's very hard for me to focus on things that I dislike. And so I've always had that issue. Um, so Matt and I think over time have gone, well, this is how we've learnt this and understood this. It would be no different for an average student if it took going through this and then this and then this in order to understand a topic, then why wouldn't we present it in the exact same way to the student? And so for me, it's always, if I'm jumping into a topic that I think is quite overwhelming. So, for example, I very recently recorded a video that's outside of my comfort zone, which is pKa, pH, acid-base balance stuff. Like it's stuff that I teach, but I was focusing more on the biochemistry of it. And I sat down, I had a dozen textbooks, I had a dozen journal articles in front of me, I had everything, and I sat back and go, oh my God, where do I start, right? But I think to begin for me, it's concepts. You just got to get the concepts. The details come later. And I think problem with students is that they try and just get everything from start to finish, like they're reading a novel, right? That it's, I've got to just read from start to finish and it's done. No, get the concepts. When you understand the concepts, details jump in so easily. So Matt and I try and focus on what we teach in the podcast and on the YouTube videos. It's all about the concepts. Very rarely do I use the complex terms. That's mainly because I probably can't pronounce them properly. But because I think that that's the information that can come later. If the student goes, I don't understand this, I'm going to watch this 15-minute video. Oh, I get that. Now I can go understand these complex aspects of it. And that's what we try and do. Concepts first, always.
The way
That's
I try to think
incredible.
of well, yeah, I love that. The way I sort of think about it is like you need a place to put things, right? And so it's like a
Yes,
wall, it's
yes.
Yeah.
like a wall of, cubbies or whatever.
I think about
And
hangers.
yeah, exactly. And then it's just like you got a pH box or a pH hanger. Now you can just put more
So true.
detail in there, but you need the space first.
Yes,
So
because it's hard to just memorize facts, which I think is what a lot of students do when they study. They just try and memorize everything. And I think you're totally right. If you create this little compartment, which is a concept, it's so much easier to fit the facts into it post hoc after you understand the concept. And it then allows you to work off first principles. So when I jump into a concept that I probably never learnt or don't know a lot about, it's fine because of first principles of other things I've learned. It's so much easier to understand because I go, well, like the sodium potassium pump. If you understand that, You can go to any system of the body and go digoxin. I can understand how that works. You can go to the nervous system. You can go here and there. Things just start to fit together. But if you have to memorize, okay, sodium reabsorption because of the sodium potassium pump in the proximal convoluted tubule aids for glucose to come in. No, it's good luck. You got too many facts to push into your head. So, yeah, it's about those concepts first.
Incredible. I wish I had had that mentality when I was a college student taking orgo, because I was
Oh
very
God,
bad
yeah.
at that.
Me too.
Just brought
Me
me
too.
back. I'll have to watch this video. But Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. The admiration is very mutual. I'm honored that you listen to our show. Can you walk us through any take-home points that you have?
No, in all honesty, I think everyone that's listening to this show needs to keep listening to this show and give this show a 5-star and comment and say how amazing it is, because it's brilliant. And the tutorials are amazing. I'll never call it X. It'll always be Twitter, because you can't have an X-torial. It must be a tutorial. And please keep doing what you guys are doing, because I love it. And we need quality medical education, and this is a huge part of it.
Mike, really, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
We've been looking forward to this,
Yeah.
for a while, and we're just so glad that you took the time to hang out with us. So thank you.
No, honestly, thank you so much for having me, and I hope that was okay, and I hope it was enjoyable.
Great.
Anytime, I need to get you guys on our podcast. That's what we're going to do. We don't usually have guests, but I need to get you guys on our podcast, because that would be awesome. But you probably don't want to waste 2 hours talking about something, but we could do a shorter version.
No arguments
we
here.
could do it on Riverside.
Yes, this is brilliant.
setup.
I've never used this before.
It's really nice.
Thank you both, and enjoy the rest of your day. No, it's nighttime. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Sleep well.
Yes,
have
sleep
a
well.
wonderful day, Mike. It's so
Thank you.
wild. It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow in the future. See you both.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Curious Clinicians. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Claire Morgan of NotEarly.com is our podcast audio editor, and Giancarlo Bonomo is a producer for the show. You can join our mailing list at CuriousClinicians.com to stay up to date on episode releases, have detailed notes delivered directly to your inbox. You can subscribe to our Substack at thecuriousclinicians.substack.com or to our YouTube channel, The Curious Clinicians Podcast. Physicians and other healthcare professionals can earn CME and MOC credits from VCU Health just for listening to the episode. For more information, visit ce.vcuhealth.org/CuriousClinicians. And as always, the information contained in this episode is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Until next time, we've been the Curious Clinicians.